Hi, and welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 16, Plant Diversity. So we've already talked about microbes, we've talked about the kingdom of fungi. We're now getting on to the kingdom Plantae. So remember, we're in the domain eukaryote. These are all eukaryotic cells, okay? And now we're getting into the domain Plantae. Different than the domain Animalia. That's what we're going to be focusing on starting next lecture. But today we're going to be focusing on plants. So let's talk a little bit about the 3D structure of plants. You guys are somewhat familiar with what plants look like. You probably have a plant in your house, or at least you can look out the window and see some kind of plant right now. So let's look at a generalized characteristic body plan of these plants. So let's start at the bottom, shall we? So this right here is the roots. And this, again, should not shock you guys. Most of you are fairly familiar with what plants look like, but you might not know some of the functions of these structures. So the roots, the most important part of the roots is not only are they anchoring the plant to the actual soil, keeping it in place so it doesn't fall over, but it's actually doing some really important other things like absorbing nutrients and water. So this is really important for a plant. So when you water the plant, it's not necessarily this upper part so much that gets the water or needs the water. I mean, it does need the water, but it's getting it all from down here. So the root system is actually going to be doing the bulk of the water absorption, especially when we talk about vascular plants. Right, their vascular system is going to be what allows them to take the water from these roots and send it all the way up that, say, super huge redwood tree. So if you've ever wondered why, those trees can get so big, especially if only the water absorption is coming from the roots, how do they get that water from the roots all the way to that super tall, 60, 80, 90-foot tree? And that's actually a vascular system. We're going to talk about what that is coming up in just a little bit. And we're also going to see a video on it too to help you kind of explain that. So next up is going to be this little shoot right here. And it is called a shoot because essentially you have a seed and it shoots up and out of the seed. So really that's why it's called a shoot. Most people call it a stem or stalk. But again, really realistically, this would be the shoot right here. And that's going to be supporting the plant. That's going to be giving the plant that 3D structure, putting it up, and out of the soil and towards that sunlight. So that 3D shoot area, again, is going to be this area right in here. Next up, we have the leaves. Again, this is not something that you were shocked about. Oh, plants have leaves. No, but the leaves are really, really important for photosynthesis. So that's where the bulk of photosynthesis is happening. Yes, there are chlorophyll cells in other parts of the plant, but really the leaves are where photosynthesis is happening. So you need nice, big, healthy leaves to actually get that maximum photosynthesis. And we're going to talk about the different types of leaves as well. Because not all plants have those big, what's called a broad leaf. Sometimes they have little pine needles and stuff like that, but they all still, again, do photosynthesis. So that's the important part for the leaves. When we talk about the underneath of the leaf, this is something we already learned about when we talked about our photosynthesis lab, right? The top is really where the photosynthesis is happening because that's gathering all the sun. The bottom is where you have things like the stomata. Remember, the stomata are those little mouths, it means little mouth. And that's where they're doing gas exchange. So they need to take in CO2 and they need to release out that oxygen as a byproduct. So to take in CO2, to take in oxygen, we have a mouth and lungs, we go, right? And you take that in. For them, they don't have any of that, and they don't need oxygen, they need CO2. So they open their little stomata, either at night or during the day, depending on the type of plant. Remember, go back to photosynthesis lab if you don't remember the difference between C4 and CAM plants and stuff like that. That's in our photosynthesis lecture. But again, the stomata are found on the underside of the leaves right here. And that's, again, for the gas exchange. Very important for these plants to do. They need that CO2 in their cells, and they need to release that oxygen out of their cells. The cuticle is basically like a little, it's a waxy covering on these leaves. Remember, these leaves are where the stomata is. Those leaves are where they're going to be hit by the sun to do photosynthesis. That's going to make them very hot, and it's going to make them susceptible to things like evaporation. Now, if you need water to survive, and these absolutely do, remember when we talked about our osmosis lab and diffusion, right? These guys need to stay nice and big and bulky, full of water, constantly having that water influx in. So you do not want to have any kind of water loss. You don't want evaporation to happen because then you dry up and you die. And everybody has seen a plant that they forgot to water and it has dried up and died. So again, we want to keep our plants nice and healthy and full of water. So this cuticle that kind of covers the leaf is like this waxy material, this substance that kind of protects them. Remember oil and waxes, remember waxes are just lipids. They don't really mix very well. So again, you're not going to have that water evaporation through that cuticle. So that waxy cuticle kind of keeps it protected, kind of keeps it nice and packaged so that you don't actually get evaporation happening. So very, very important for these plants to have a waxy cuticle to keep that water in. This is also why water beads up on a leaf. So if you see a leaf and it's raining, you'll see those little droplets of water on the leaf. That's because the water doesn't get absorbed into anything. It's sitting on top of a waxy layer. So it essentially just beads up on itself because it has nowhere else to go, and then eventually rolls off and drops off. So that's that waxy cuticle that's responsible for that. The flowers up here. Now remember, not all plants have flowers. Those are just the angiosperms, not the gymnosperms, not the bryophytes. We're going to learn all about the different groups of plants. But if you see a flower, you know for a fact it has to be an angiosperm, a flowering plant, a true flowering plant. Now if you do see a flower, this is the reproductive structure. So I hate to say this, but when you take that flower and you put it up to your nose and you're smelling it, essentially you're taking the reproductive structure and putting it to your face. So, yeah, you might think twice when you smell a flower. Don't. It's fine. It's not like our reproductive structure. It's a beautiful flower that smells delicious. And there's a reason why they smell good. And we're going to talk about that as well. So essentially these are just containing their spores. They're containing these, the ovaries and the ovules. And so essentially it's their reproductive structure. You have both female parts and male parts here up in this flower. And that's because these flowering plants are going to go through sexual reproduction. Not all the time, but they do go through sexual reproduction. And that's why you want to have things like pollen to get carried away by little bees, because essentially that's the form of sexual reproduction. You're taking your sperm and you're transferring it to a different egg or a different flower. And that's, again, how they're going to do sexual reproduction with the help of these bees, which is why bees are so important to our planet. So important to our planet. Scientists are now saying if we lose the bees, we might lose something like 70% of all species on the planet, because if you're not a plant, you might eat a plant or you might be dependent on a plant. And therefore, if you're not getting this reproduction via these bees, a lot of these flowering plants, and that's a huge food source for us, is also going to die out. Not just us, but lots of organisms on the planet. So bees, guys, save your bees. Don't kill bees. Bees are really important. Go start a bee colony. No, you don't have to. But again, be nice to bees. What else? Let's see. Oh, so not all plants are true plants. So algae, we're going to learn a little bit about algae, but algae are, should not shock you, in the ocean. There's also aquatic algae, freshwater algae as well. This right here is a little green algae. This looks like ulva species. This essentially is just not a true plant, but kind of like the precursor to actual plants. So remember that life started in the ocean, right, with tiny little bacteria. And then eventually they had things like, algae, and they moved on to animals, and all this stuff started to evolve out of the ocean. Well, this is a algae, and it's a green algae in the phylum, or the division Chlorophyta. And so what we actually believed is that this is the ancestor of true plants. So this guy eventually, and he obviously didn't walk up on land, but eventually started colonizing land, moving farther and farther up onto land. And that's actually where you got things like the first bryophytes and the ferns. And then eventually you had the transition over to the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So again, green algae, division Chlorophyta, is the ancestor, the precursor to actual modern day plants. So it all started here with the algae. Now these algae down here, this is a little bit of marine biology for you, but this right here is not a root. It's not a true root. It's called a holdfast. And it literally holds fast. Like that's all it does. So as the roots here, they kind of anchor the plant into the soil. This guy doesn't have, this guy does nutrient absorption and water absorption. This one does not. So they both anchor to the bottom, but this has no water absorption nor nutrient absorption via their holdfast. So that's one of the differences between algae and true plants. They still have this big leafy, broadleaf kind of structure. And again, that's for photosynthesis. So that green color, lots of chlorophyll, which means lots of photosynthesis is going on. But they're surrounded by water, so they don't need to do water or nutrient absorption via their holdfast. They can actually just do that via the whole piece of algae. So pretty awesome stuff we're going to be learning about today. Hopefully you find plants more interesting after this lecture. It's not just a tree. It's actually, you can probably tell what kind of tree it is. Is it going to be a monocot? Is it a dicot? I don't know. I don't know what kind of tree it is, but we're going to learn, and that's what you're going to find out today. So let's talk about the 4 different groups of plants. And yes, you will have to identify the 4 different groups and tell you a little bit how they're different. We're not going to go into, really in depth on this, but, this could be a very good essay question. Why are they different? How are they different? Give me some examples of each. So make sure that you guys can at least do that and have some examples on standby. So these are our bryophytes up here. These are our non-vascular plants. Vascular system kind of means like a transportation system. So if you have a vascular plant, like some of these guys over here, these vascular plants have xylem and phloem. And essentially, it's just a transportation system. So they're sending water, they're sending nutrients, they're sending, CO2, they're sending things through the plant via this vascular system. Now, these bryophytes are typically very small and low to the ground because they don't have this vascular system. So when you get to these actual larger things like these gymnosperms and these angiosperms, those are those really big trees that we're talking about because of the vascular system. It actually allows them to transport water from the roots all the way to the very, very top of the tree, which is important because then trees can actually grow taller because of that vascular system. They can become a little bit more complex because of the vascular system. So bryophytes are the non-vascular plants. The rest of them are vascular. So all 3 of these are vascular plants. The ferns are considered seedless vascular plants. So they have a vascular system, they have that transportation system, but they do not have true seeds. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Now, the gymnosperms do have seeds, so both of these guys actually have seeds, but the gymnosperms are known as naked seeds. So these are not protected in kind of like a coating like the angiosperms. So the gymnosperms kind of have this like naked seed, and you can think of like a pine cone, classic example of a gymnosperm. So if you see a pine cone, you know for a fact, oh, that's a big naked seed, right? It's not protected by anything. That must be a gymnosperm. And then finally, when you get to the angiosperms, really easy to identify, does it have a flower? Then it's an angiosperm. Boom. Okay, so this is the only one that actually has flowers. These have naked seeds like those big pine cones. These are the seedless vascular plants, pretty much just the ferns. So if you know what a fern looks like, right, they have all these little, essentially it's like little pollen at the bottom that they're going to release, and we're going to talk about all of that reproductive stuff in just a second. And then finally, we have our bryophytes, which are very small, simple. The first actual like land plants are the bryophytes, and then they get more complex and more complex as they move along. So remember, bryophytes are the only ones that are non-vascular. The other 3 are all vascular. And then we're going to talk about the differences as well in just a second. Oh, but right now we're going to watch a little video on the differences between plants and how they got there, evolutionarily wise. So we'll pause for the video.
In this video, we begin part 3 in our unit on diversity. We'll be discussing plant diversity and the evolutionary relationship between plants. Let's begin with a general overview of what plants are. In the kingdom Plantae, what are the general characteristics? Well, plants of course are eukaryotic, they're multicellular, they're autotrophic, more specifically, they're photosynthetic, and they have cell walls. Their cells have cell walls made of cellulose. We can find plants living in water and on land, and even plants that grow on other plants, epiphytes. During this overview of plants, we're going to look at some larger groups of plants. We're going to look at the non-vascular plants, the bryophytes, an example of which would be mosses. We're going to look at the vascular seedless plants, or the spore-bearing vascular plants. An example would be ferns. And then we're going to look at the vascular plants, the seed plants, the vascular seed plants. And within the vascular seed plants, we're going to break that up into 2 major divisions: the gymnosperms, which are typically cone-bearing plants, like a pine tree, and also the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. Within the angiosperms, we're going to divide it one step further into monocots and dicots. Now, in this first part, we're just going to introduce kind of the concepts of plants and more the evolution of plants and where did plants come from. The origin of plants. Well, we talked in our unit on protists that when we looked at the plant-like protists, specifically the green algae, we got some insight into where the origin of plants may have come from. We know that the green algae, the chlorophyta, have the same photopigments that we find in modern plants. So the suggestion is that these plants evolved from this green algae. Well, to do that we have to make some adaptations because algae are fully aquatic and plants eventually evolved to move in onto land. So we can see some pictures of different various plants over here. So how do we get from here to here? What specific adaptations will we see which will allow for successful life on land? Well, let's consider what's the difference between life in water and life on land. What are the obstacles that living on land presents that we don't have when we live in water? Well, let's investigate. Adaptations helpful for plant life on land. Hold on one second, let's do it this way. Oops, so we can get them one at a time. We need a system of absorption. What do we mean? How do we get our water in? Well, if you're an aquatic plant surrounded by water, it's easy to absorb from your surroundings. But what about these plants that live up here on land? Where do they get their water? That's right, they get their water from the soil. So we need some system of absorption, either roots or rhizoids, which are root-like structures found in some plants. So in our investigation of plants, we'll see the evolution of roots. We need to prevent desiccation. What does it mean to prevent desiccation? Well, the word desiccation means drying out. So we need to prevent drying out. How do we prevent drying out? Well, as plants evolved to be successful on land, they developed a waxy coating called the cuticle. You can see the cuticle on the top of these cells here and these cells here. This waxy cuticle, if you touch a plant's leaf, it feels kind of waxy. You can see over here in this picture how the water beads up on that leaf. Now, in this case, we see water being kept out of the leaf, but think about all the moisture inside the leaf that waxy coat is trapping in. Again, living in water, this is not a problem. But when you move on to land, drying out is a real problem. So we need to prevent desiccation. And plants evolved a waxy cuticle to solve this problem. Now, interestingly, in the solving of one problem, we actually created another problem. How are we going to get gases in and out of the cell? What do we mean? Hold on. We need a system of gas exchange other than diffusion. We know that the cells inside this leaf are living cells and that for photosynthesis to occur, they need to take carbon dioxide in. Well, before waxy cuticle, the carbon dioxide might be able to diffuse across this cell, but the carbon dioxide molecules have trouble diffusing across this waxy coat. And oxygen that's made as a waste product of photosynthesis would accumulate inside the leaves and would need to diffuse out, but again it gets trapped by this waxy coat. Well, the solving of the one problem, preventing desiccation or drying out, created a new problem. We need a way to exchange these gases. And the answer to that, the system of gas exchange other than diffusion, is an opening on the underside of the leaf that you see right here. This opening is called a stoma. The plural of stoma is stomata, and on the undersides of leaves there are many stomata, these openings. Whoops, where'd it go? Stomata. And this allows the exchange of gases in and out of the leaf. So, we solved one problem, created another, solved that problem with stomata. We can get gases in and out of our leaf. The next problem we need to solve is how do we get our gametes to each other? We need a method of gamete transportation that doesn't rely on water. If you're an aquatic organism, the gametes can swim to one another. If we look at this reproductive cycle here of this algae, the gametes are released into the water and they can swim to one another. Well, you can't do that on land. So, plants have evolved a method of gamete transportation that doesn't rely on water. Do you know what it is? Right, pollen. Pollen is a way to transport the male gamete from one organism to another. And the pollen can be moved by wind, from tree to tree or plant to plant, but also we know that there are biotic vectors or living things like bees or butterflies or hummingbirds that can move pollen from one place to the other. So we have a method of gamete transportation that doesn't rely on water. How about a system of support? In water, do you need thick woody structures to support and hold you up? Well, no. The density of the water and the buoyancy that creates allows organisms that live in water to not need these woody structures, these fibrous structures, or an internal system of support that we would see in land plants. So we're going to see the development of fibrous and woody structures, and also a system of vascular tissue. Now this vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, we can see that over here also, is a system of internal piping that goes throughout the plant. Now these pipes provide some internal structural support for the plant so that the plant can stand up without the water holding it up. So we need structural support. We also need a system of conduction. Well, what do we mean? Well, here's an example. Look at this. Whoops. Grab this. Take that away. Look at this tree. Now this is an extreme example, but how do you get water to the cells at the top of that tree, since the water is down here in the ground? And how do you get food, photosynthetically derived food from these leaves up here, down to all these cells in the trunk, down to the root? Well, or look at this rose plant over here. How do we move materials throughout this large multicellular body? We need a system of conduction. The equivalent in animals is a circulatory system. What do we have in plants to help circulate materials? And the answer is the same as the answer for system of support, and that's vascular tissue. The vascular tissue is a system of internal pipes that allows the transport of water and sugar and minerals throughout the plant. It's like plumbing. It's very important if you're a large multicellular organism to have an efficient means of transporting materials across distance that doesn't rely just on diffusion. Diffusion is fine over small distances, but over great distances we need a more dedicated system. So we have vascular tissue. And this vascular tissue not only provides that conduction, but also the structural support we were looking at. There are two types of vascular tissue we find in plants. Xylem, which is for the conduction of water and dissolved minerals, and phloem, which is for the conduction of sugars. Typically, the water is transported upwards from the roots to the upper parts of the plants, and the sugars are transported from the leaves down to other parts of the plant. So let's recap. Adaptation is helpful for plant life on land. We need a system of absorption. We need a way to get water from the soil into the plant, roots and rhizoids. We need to prevent desiccation or drying out. We have a waxy coating called cuticle. We need a system of gas exchange other than diffusion to get in the gases in and out of the leaf, and the answer to that is stomata, the holes in the undersides of leaves. We need a system of structural support, like fibrous and woody structures, but also the vascular tissue. We need a system of conduction, vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, to help transport materials throughout the body. And we need a method of gamete transportation that doesn't rely on water, and that problem will be solved by pollen. Now, not every plant that is successful has every one of these adaptations. But we're going to see as we move through our unit on plants the evolution of these systems and some trends. So let's stop and take a look at some of those trends. Now this is going to look a little repetitive as we see the evolution of root stems and leaves, the evolution of vascular tissue, the evolution of a water conservation mechanism, waxy cuticle, the evolution of stomata. I'm going to jump over this one for a minute. The evolution of pollen as a way for fertilization. But there's a couple things on here that we haven't talked about that are going to become important. Like this one. We're going to see in our study of plants a change as we look at the life cycles from a dominant haploid or gametophyte stage to a dominant sporophyte or diploid stage. This will be evident as we detail the different life cycles of the different types of plants. Alright, so that's a different one that we haven't talked about yet. And like I said, we'll see the evolution of pollen. And another one of the trends we're going to see is the evolution of seeds. We think, well, yeah, all plants have seeds. Well, not true. we're going to see that we have plants that lack seeds, and then we're going to gain seeds as we kind of move through our comparison of different plants. We're going to see the evolution of flowers and cones and fruit, all which either aid in reproduction or in seed dispersal. Now, most of these adaptations are related to this movement from water onto land and a lessening reliance on an aquatic environment, but some of them don't. So, as we move through, we're going to build kind of a dichotomous tree. We're going to build a pathway to work our way through the groups of plants and classify plants based on certain characteristics. It'll go something like this. Let's say we have an organism and we determine that it is a plant. We need to ask a question to determine what type of plant. And the first question we can ask is this plant vascular? Does it have vascular tissue? Well, if the answer is no, then it is a bryophyte. If the answer is yes, well, then it's a vascular plant. Well, lots of plants are vascular. So we need to ask another question. Seeds or spores? Well, if the answer is seeds, we go this direction. And if the answer is spores, we'll go this direction. And if it's spores, then we have a group called the seedless vasculars or the spore-bearing vasculars. I'm not fitting that in there very well, but you get the point. And there's lots of seed plants. So on this side there are seed plants. We need to ask another question. And that question is flowers? If the answer is no, let's put the no in there, then we have a group of plants called gymnosperms. And if the answer is yes, and I lost my other yes, so I'll just make another one. If the answer is yes, then we have a group of plants called angiosperms. Well, we're going to differentiate between the angiosperms by asking ourselves the question, how many cotyledons? And you don't need to know what that is yet, but we will talk about it. And if the answer to that question is 1, then we have plants called monocots, 1 cotyledon. And if the answer is 2, we have dicotyledonous plants. So we can build this classification tree of sorts for plants. We're going to be coming back to this chart over and over in the next video and in the rest of the unit as we go to at the end of each of these and discuss this type of plant. So we'll talk about bryophytes, we'll give an example. We'll talk about the seedless vasculars, we'll give an example. We'll talk about gymnosperms and angiosperms and then the difference between monocots and dicots. Basically we're focusing on the end of these branches and the types of plants that exist there. We can go ahead and put in some examples here. An example of a bryophyte are the mosses. We're going to use mosses as the poster child for all bryophytes. For the seedless vasculars or the spore-bearing vasculars, we're going to talk about ferns. We'll use ferns as the poster child of the seedless vasculars. For gymnosperms, we'll talk about pine trees as our poster child for gymnosperms. And basically we can pick any flowering plant for angiosperms. We're going to look at the life cycle, the characteristics of mosses, ferns, pine trees, and flowering plants. Come back for the next video where we'll go through each of those.
Okay, so let's talk about the reproductive methods for just a second. And you can see in what we saw in the video is that they kind of go through this alternating stage during their life of either being a gametophyte or being a sporophyte. And so this is kind of confusing to people. And again, we're not going to go into super crazy detail on this, but you do need to know that they go through this alternation of generations where they're kind of switching back and forth between these two body types. So one of them, the gametophyte, is like the base of the word says gameto. It's a gamete. So again, this is where you're going to have half of the number of chromosomes that you should have, because what you want to do is you want to go through fertilization. So you want to go through sexual reproduction with another plant so that you can actually get fertilization so that you can now get into your sporophyte actual body form. The sporophyte body form actually has the total number of chromosomes that you should have. So you can see right here, the gametophyte is the haploid, the sporophyte is the diploid version. So these little spore capsules are produced, and again, that's what's going to be released, and these spores are the gametes. Okay, so spores you can think of are kind of like the male reproductive, like the sperm. So sperm and spores, kind of the same thing, kind of pollen. Those are all like the male reproductive parts, the sperm parts. Okay, so then through fertilization, you can actually get the sperm mixing with the eggs, and now you'll have your full zygote, which is going to turn back into your sporophyte. So essentially, they're just going back from the sporophyte, releasing the spores kind of in an asexual way, to produce this little gametophyte. So now they have this gametophyte. He's producing his gametes, and again, he's looking to do sexual reproduction so that they can come together, and through fertilization, that they can actually make that sporophyte. So it does depend on the species of plants, and actually the group of plants, whether you're going to be gametophyte dominant or sporophyte dominant, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But again, you don't have to know exactly how this works. We're basically just going from the gametophyte stage to the sporophyte stage, back to the gametophyte stage, via this alternations of generations. So depending on the generation, you're going to either be more dominant, the sporophyte, or more dominant as the gametophyte. But it's basically just a switching of the two forms. All right, so looking more in depth at some of these reproductive structures, if you are going to go through sexual reproduction, you're going to need some kind of gametes. And so looking at this angiosperm that we have here, we know it's an angiosperm because it is a flower. Okay, and this is our reproductive structure. It does have both male parts and female parts in it because plants are hermaphrodites, right? They can either reproduce asexually and just do that budding off, or they can reproduce sexually, and that would be the mixture of the the gametes from the gametophytes. So you have your sperm, and you have your eggs, you have your pollen and your spores, and then you have what's called the ovary right here, the ovules. So inside the ovary, which is this whole entire structure right here, is the ovule, and the ovule is actually what's going to develop into those seeds. And what's going to develop into, at least right here, is going to be that fruiting part of the plant that's actually gets developed. This right here is going to be called the style. So the big long one that's actually coming up from the ovary. So this is kind of like the tube into the ovary. This is known as the style. When you get to the very, very end right here, this is known as the stigma. The stigma is like the sticky end. It's kind of like where the nectar is. And again, that's where you want the bees to go. So the bees are going to land on the flower. They're going to pick up some pollen right here from the anther. So this little end tip right here, right, this little guy right here, that's going to be known as the anther. That actually produces the pollen. Okay, the pollen attracts things like bees, and then the flower can produce things like nectar, and so the bees are going to they're going to crawl around, they're going to get covered in this pollen, and then hopefully they're going to fly to another flower, and then they're going to actually feed right here off the sticky end of the stigma. That will actually cause some of the pollen to fall down into the style, all the way down into the ovary, and actually fertilize that ovule. And so that's the whole point of this, is to get bees and stuff to come around, and other pollinators to come around and pick up some of your pollen and transport it to another flower's ovary, essentially. The long stalk that contains the anther, so the anther is the very end of it, but the long stalk is known as the filament. That's just the supporting stalk. Again, you want to get your pollen nice and high so that those bees actually have a good chance of actually encountering it, getting covered in, and then flying off to another plant to, again, deposit those little bits into a different flower's ovule. Now, plants can self-fertilize if they actually have to, and sometimes by accident. Some of the pollen can actually get in here and start to fertilize the plant. And this is kind of an asexual sexual reproduction, because you're reproducing with yourself. Not the worst thing in the world, because you are a plant. But again, really, always you want genetic diversity. You want variation, and that variation is going to come from an individual that's not you or related to you. So that's why bees and stuff are such great pollinators, because they do fly. They fly long distances and travel to other areas, so that when they land on a flower far away from you that must be distantly related to you. So now you reproduce with someone who's not your cousin, not you, right? And that's really what you always want to do. You always want those new genes coming in. That's what we learned about in evolution. You want those new genes coming in. And that's still true of flowers. No shock to you guys, these big colorful things are called the petals. They're actually very brightly colored to attract the pollinators. So it's not just flowers want to be pretty. They produce those pigments and those bright colors, which are stored in those vacuoles, to get those pollinators to come to them. Again, they can't really reproduce. They can reproduce with themselves, but that's not what they want. And they can't walk down the street to their neighbor's house to go find a date, right? They have to rely on these pollinators. So that's why the petals are so brightly colored. And usually they even have like these reflective properties that the bees can see really, really well. My car is extremely brightly colored. Bees are attracted to it all the time. There's always bees flying to my car, landing on my car, coming after my car, because it's got this bright, shiny color, just like the petals. It attracts the bees. So don't wear bright colors if you want to stay away from bees. The sepal right here, the sepal is essentially 2 little leaves. So when the flower, before the flower actually blooms, it's in a little bud. When that bud opens up, you actually see the petals and stuff start to come out. The sepals are what the bud is covered in. So then when it blooms, it opens up, and then the sepals kind of fold outward just like that, and then you have the inside blooms that actually bloom out into the flower structure. So should you know the structure of this flower? Yes. Should you be able to list all of these things and tell me what they do? Yes. And that will absolutely be on your test. It's a really easy test question. So just make sure to study this. Practice drawing it if you want to. It's a really good way of actually memorizing where all these things go and what they do. Here's an example. Again, this is our flower right here. This is a hibiscus, or a type of hibiscus. And again, you've got your petals, you've got your sepals underneath, you've got your anthers, you've got your filaments, you've got your little stigma and your stomata, your little stigma and your stamen. So make sure that, again, if I gave you this flower and possibly asked you to label, you can tell me this is the petal, you can tell me this is the anther, you can tell me this is the filament, right? You can tell me or at least label all these things. So make sure, because not all flowers look like this perfect picture right here. So this one obviously looks pretty close, so I'd probably do something like that on your exam or your quiz, but just make sure that you're, actively paying attention to these parts and stuff like that. So again, this is kind of how reproduction happens when you're talking about a flowering plant. So essentially you have a mature sporophyte, okay, with the flower right here. These guys are going to be producing things like pollen, right? That pollen is the male reproductive organ. That is essentially the sperm. So what can happen, again, this is if you're self-fertilizing, not ideal, but totally is fine. You're going to get that pollen, you're going to get it inside the little stigma right here, which is going to go down into the ovule, the ovary. Essentially what it's going to do is it's going to start fertilizing this right here. So you have your egg on the inside, and then the sperm are actually going to come inside the egg just like it does normally, right? That sperm is actually going to penetrate the egg and fertilize the egg. Now you actually have a developing embryo, or in this case what we call an endosperm. So that endosperm or that embryo is going to grow. It's going to start producing its own little sporophyte inside. And then finally, inside that seed, you're actually going to get that little fruit. So the seed actually comes from the ovule. The fruit actually comes from the ovary. So again, you've got your ovule, which is this part right here. You've got your ovary, which is this larger encasing part right here. So the fruit part, right, is the ovary part. And on the inside, that's going to be the ovule part. So like a seed would be the ovule. So think of like a pear, right? The fruiting part that you're going to actually eat is the ovary. The seed on the inside is the ovule. Okay, so that's the part, the seed part that you don't eat. But if you want to go plant, you can actually grow a peach tree from that peach seed because it's already fertilized little embryo. So then you're going to get development. Now you have your actual hard seed. The seed, when germinated, will actually start to produce these little shoots right here. And again, the roots will grow down, the shoots will grow up, and then you actually have your little sporophyte seedling. So again, I'm never going to ask you guys to actually write this out. I just want you to kind of like understand the gist of it, and I can ask you some, questions on it. So make sure that you at least understand it. No, you don't have to memorize exactly every single step, but know the difference between the fruit and the seed and where they're coming from. So which comes from the ovule, which comes from the ovary, and again, the parts of the flower that we just learned about in the last slide. So this is not plant biology. You're not going to have to know absolutely everything about this, but again, make sure that you understand it. If you don't understand it, please, please, please ask me questions, watch more videos on your own. There's a million resources out there for this stuff. So you guys have plenty to study off of. All right, so we already talked about pollinators and why they're so important, but lots of flowers have different strategies of attracting said pollinators. So we already talked about one of them, which is being really brightly colored, right? So those bright colors are definitely going to attract pollinators. It's just the colors that they like. It's the way that they see. They look at it and they go, oh, I really want to go over there. Another thing is having things like nectar. If you have a food source for the pollinator is more likely to stop by, right? Oh, that delicious flower has some nectar in it that I want to eat. Then they get covered in that pollen. They actually, have you seen it? It's actually really cute. They're like bees that have eaten so much nectar, pass out in the flower. It's cute. It's like they get drunk and they're just, really, it's like they get a food coma. So they're eating so much and it's probably warm out and they're just like, ugh. And then they just pass out. It's really cute. You see these little fat little bee butts poking out of flowers. So again, nectar, a food source, is going to be great to have these bees actually come over and feed on your flower. So when they're feeding on you, it doesn't hurt you, and you actually get to sexually reproduce because that bee is now covered in the pollen. It's going to fly to the next flower and hopefully be able to fertilize that ovary. Some flowers get a little bit tricky. This right here is not a bee. Okay? So this is not a bee. It looks like a bee, but it's not a bee. In fact, it's the part of the flower that actually is supposed to mimic a bee. And so now the bee is looking at it going, that looks like a sexy little lady bee. I'm going to go over there and have some, nookie with her. So again, the bee actually comes over and doesn't pretend, but he kind of gets it on with the flower. But once again, the flower's like, perfect. That's not actually even my sexual, well, it is my sexual reproduction organ, but we're not even actually having sex. You're kind of humping the flower and releasing the pollen while you're there. So that's what the flowers want. They want the pollen traveled from one flower to another to do their sexual reproduction. So tricking a bee to come over because it thinks it's a sexy little lady bee actually works, because then the bee stops by, does his bee business, and then drops that pollen when he's there, and therefore hopefully you'll get that fertilization. So you either want to attract them with the big bright colors, and you want to get them there because you have nectar or some kind of food source that they can use, or you want to pretend to be one of their mates and then have him come over and do his business. Sorry, I had to. So that they can actually, again, deposit that pollen in that sperm. Yeah. So again, plants can't move. They can't get up and walk to their neighbor's house to go on a date. So they get the bees to do their business for them. And therefore they can just stay in their happy little flower plant form, and they actually have the bees do all the work and pollinate each one of them. So that's again why bees are so important on our planet. It's not just for honey. It's really they're pollinating the bulk of the plants on the entire planet, especially if it's producing some kind of fruit, which we eat a lot of. All of those would be gone. So think about like your avocados, your peaches, your just everything, anything that is a fruiting body is going to come from these pollinators. And so it's really important that we keep these around and keep these nice and healthy. Now, just as like we learned in the video, there are two different types of angiosperms. So yes, if it is a flower, it is an angiosperm, but there is a monocot and a dicot, and you will have to know the difference between monocots and dicots. So here's a little chart to kind of help you guys out, at least guide you in the right direction. Now, the monocots are on the top, the eucots are on the bottom. Eucots are also called dicots. So if you hear me say dicot and eucot or eudicot, it's the same thing. At least in our class, we're going to keep them the same thing. So if you hear me use those two terms interchangeably, that's why, because they're basically the same thing. Now start reading with the monocots. Kind of easy to tell. The easiest way for me is when it comes to the flowers and the roots. So when you look at the roots, they have what's called a fibrous root system. So as the roots grow, they kind of grow in this very like fanned out kind of way. And that's different than the eudicots or the dicots. So you can see here, this is known as a taproot. So a taproot kind of goes, it almost like drills one down and then branches off from that. So you have one main taproot going down and then a bunch of little roots that come off of that. Different than the fibrous roots, which pretty much branch evenly throughout. So again, really easy way to look at them is looking at the roots. Another one are the flowers. Yes, they all have flowers because they're all angiosperms, but monocots and dicots have different number of flowers. So when you look at the monocots, they usually have multiples of 3. 3, 6, 9, 12, that's how many petals that the monocots are going to have. When it comes to the dicots, or the eudicots, they're usually going to be in about 4s or 5s. So again, if you have 8, if you have 12, and again, 12 is kind of tricky because also 12 is it's a multiple of 3, so that's kind of a hard one. But if you have 8, if you have 10, 5, 4, all of those again are going to be just those eudicots. Getting into the vascular bundles, again, vascular system is that transportation system that we learned about. You're transporting water, you're transporting nutrients, you're transporting your gases. Whatever you need to do, you're transporting it in these vascular systems. Essentially, it's like veins and arteries, right? These little kind of connecting tubes that are going to be transporting stuff. So if we look at the vascular bundles when it comes to the monocots, they're essentially kind of scattered. So they kind of have this like outer ring and then they're kind of scattered on the inside. They don't really have like a very clear structure. But when it comes to the eudicots, they're all in this very singular ring and they're all connected. So not only are they, going up the plant, but they're also connected to each other via these rings. So again, does it have a ring or is it just kind of scattered? If it's scattered, it's going to be a monocot. If it has a ring, it's going to be a eudicot or a dicot. Looking at the veins, another very obvious thing. If you've ever looked at like a palm tree, right, or even blades of grass, they have very, very parallel leaves, right? So the veins going down their leaves are all parallel. That's different than the eudicots that have kind of branched leaves. So it comes up and they branch this way and this way and this way and that way, right? They're not parallel, they're branched. So looking at the veins being the veins on the leaf, right? Being parallel, they're going to be a monocot. Being branched, they're going to be a dicot. And then finally, these little cotyledons, these essentially are just kind of like in the developing seeds. They either have one cotyledon or they have two. If they and that's again where their name comes from. So the monocot, right, has one. The dicot or the eudicot, that means true cot, they have two. Okay, so that's what dicot means, two. And that's just in their developmental stage. You can just open up the seeds and look at the seeds. But if you were trying to do straight identification, always easiest to look at the number of flowers, the roots, or the leaves. Once you actually get inside, you can look at the vascular bundles, or you can look at the cotyledons. So again, yes, you do need to know the difference between the monocots and the dicots, but we're just getting general broad terms here. We're not really diving super detailed into all of these, but this is a really easy essay question. What's the difference between monocots and dicots? So make sure that you can at least explain everything that's going on in this picture. The vascular bundles, again, we can see our monocot right here. We know it's a monocot because the vascular bundles are scattered. Essentially what we've done is we've taken our tree and we're looking directly into that open section. So we're looking down into that stem or that shoot. And that's what we can see right here. We see these monocots, the vascular bundles kind of being separated out. Now the epidermis, epi means on top. So just like our epidermis is our skin, their epidermis is this outer layer here, usually covered in the cuticle. If you're a tree, maybe sometimes covered in bark. That center region right here, this is known as ground tissue. So that ground tissue essentially is just like the center bulky part of it. Different when it comes to the dicots though. They don't really have this ground tissue like the monocots do. They have what's known as a pith. That's their center area. And again, you can see these vascular bundles which are arranged just in the circles here and not actually sporadically just kind of spread in here. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's look at two examples of monocots and a dicots. Again, very easy to identify once you actually kind of know what you're looking at. So when we look at these monocots, if you were to actually look at these leaves, they're going to be, there's long, very, very parallel veins on those leaves. But if you were to look at one of these more complicated trees, they're going to be way more branched. So again, that's going to be the difference. Palm trees, grasses, these are all monocots. The larger trees that you're thinking of, oaks and elms and stuff like that, those are all going to be the actual dicots, and they're much more complicated, a little bit more girthy, typically bigger, heavier duty, stuff like that. And it's usually just because of the vascular bundles and the way they're designed. Okay, so let's look at the difference between the root system and the shoot system. Remember, when we're growing, as we're growing down, these are the roots. So this is part of our root system. As we're growing up above ground, this is our shoot system. So that's going to be our flower and our actual plant that you see. So shoot system above the ground, root system below the ground. And here's some kind of common functions of each. So we are let's start with the root system. So we're below ground right here. This would be a taproot. So in this case, you would have a monocot or a dicot if you have a taproot. That's right, it's a dicot. So that's where you have one root going down and then the roots kind of branching off of that. So the primary root right here would be the taproot, and then each of these coming off the sides are the lateral roots. So lateral means to the sides. So this is all of our root system down here. Now remember, it's used for anchoring, where we're trying to anchor that plant into the soil, keep it secure, keep it upright. We're doing water absorption. We're doing nutrient absorption. We are doing storage. So lots of, and that's true of the shoot system as well. We're going to be doing storage in both of them. We're going to be doing transportation in both of them, and we're going to be producing hormones in both of them. So you're like, wait, plants produce hormones? Yes, they do. Hormones are important. Excuse me. Looking at the shoot system again, now we're moving above ground. So we're all talking about everything above ground. Remember, this is the stem or also the shoot coming up, giving it that 3D structure. We have each of these little leaves that are coming off of here. These are known as blades. So each of the leaves are blades, just like an algae. It's called a blade. What you have right here is this where it little branches off into the actual leaf itself. It's called a node. And remember when we talked about phylogenetic trees? Those are called nodes. Every little branch is called a node. Same kind of thing here. That's why they're called phylogenetic trees, because they're actually named after the tree. And so when you have that leaf that kind of branches off from the main stem, that would be considered a node. This area right here in between the nodes is called the internode, or in between nodes. Right? This guy is called an axillary or auxiliary bud, and that's kind of on the side buds. It's not the end bud. It's kind of going up the middle. So any of these would be auxiliary buds right here, and then the apical bud would be the one at the very, very top, the end bud. That's kind of like where the plant is going, the direction it's going. It's not going outwards like some of these little auxiliary buds. It's going upwards, and that's the apical bud, meaning at the top. Kind of, you can think of like apex, apical, like going up. It's the peak, the top. And again, so shoot system varies from the root system just a little bit. This guy's actually going to be doing photosynthesis. It's above ground, right? We're not doing so much of the water absorption, right, or the nutrient absorption. We're up here doing the actual photosynthesis part and the reproduction part, right? Those are our flowers. Those are our buds. Those are our spores and sperm and everything that we're actually reproducing to release. That's everything is coming. The reproductive system is coming from the shoot system, the upward or above ground system. Now, sometimes these plants actually modify their roots, and sometimes it works out really well for us. So these are all actual modified roots. So this is ginger, this is radish, these are carrots. These are not fruits, right? Fruits and vegetables are different. Vegetables are typically growing underground, right? Like potatoes and other things like that. And those are usually off of the roots. And so these are actually modified roots themselves. So when you're eating the ginger or the radish or the carrots, it's a root. It is actually part of the root itself. It's not a fruit. Hence the difference between fruits and vegetables. So that's what you can see right here. In fact, when we're eating the ginger, it's actually a modified stem. It's kind of the root and the stem all at the same time. So you can see here the roots are coming off these little parts right here. And this is actually part of the stem itself. So really what you're doing is you're like eating like an underground part of the stem. So normally the shoots are all above ground. This one actually is kind of modified into this kind of awkward looking stem. And that's the ginger. And that's actually what you eat and really good for you. Apparently eating raw ginger is like really amazing for you, but it tastes terrible. So good luck with that. But yeah, so you can have modified roots like these guys right here. You can have modified stems like these guys right here. All super useful for us. Some things that are more useful to the plants would be modified leaves. So some of the plants are like, I'm tired of being eaten, so stop eating me. I'm going to develop little spikes so that you stay away from me. And that's what you see right here. These little spikes, these are from cactuses and stuff like that. And again, that's to keep predation down for the plant. They don't want to be eaten. I hate to break it to you, vegans and vegetarians, even plants know when they're being eaten. They send little just stress signals to the other cells. It's kind of sad and horrific, but they're just plants, and everything on the planet eats everything else on the planet. So, you know, circle of life here. Sometimes you just have to eat them. Now, there are some animals that can actually get around some of these spines. Probably not this particular species of cactus, but there are. These are, again, little succulents right here. So they're modified into these little bulbs. Again, and that's to help retain whatever water and store water that they actually have so that they don't dry up. Some, again, are going to be modified into these like little stick-like, little twig-like looking leaves that aren't super good at photosynthesis, but they still do have the chloroplast in them, so they still can. So, again, not all leaves look like that big broadleaf that we talked about. And we're going to talk about that when we get into ecosystems coming up. The difference between, say, like deciduous forest and broadleaf forest and pine forest and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about all the more modified leaves coming up in the next couple weeks. Some of the leaves are really modified into crazy structures like this guy right here. This is the Venus flytrap. You guys can actually buy these at the store. I had a student literally taught this, and he went to Trader Joe's right afterwards and bought one. And he was so happy. He kept sending me pictures and videos when his plant actually would eat a fly, because they do. They do. They're one of the few heterotrophic plants out there. Remember, autotroph means self-feeding. So these plants are self-feeding with light. You know, they're photoautotrophs, self-feeding with light, doing photosynthesis. Well, this Venus flytrap still does photosynthesis, but he also gets nutrients from an alternative source, and that would be this little guy right here. And we're going to see a video on that right now and see how cool these Venus flytraps are, because they are definitely the epitome of a modified leaf right here. So let's go ahead and watch that video right now.
The Venus flytrap. Like the sundew, it makes itself very attractive, oozing nectar across the brim of each leaf. But any visiting insect had better watch out for these 6 tiny hairs. This fly has to tread carefully. If it strikes one hair, it can carry on feeding, but a timer has been set. A second strike in less than 20 seconds, and the fly is doomed. An electrical impulse is triggered, and the leaf snaps shut in just a fraction of a second. The tips lock together like prison bars. If the fly is very big or very small, it may just manage to escape. But most are trapped and die. Ten days later, the trap reopens. All that remains is a husk. The plant has finished its meal and resets itself for its next victim.
Okay, guys, I hope you found that video absolutely fascinating. It really is crazy how they can, they can trap the fly, and then they release this digestive enzyme that essentially turns the fly's insides into goo, and then they drink the fly completely dry, and that's that husk that was left at the end, that empty exoskeleton, because it's an arthropod, it is an exoskeleton just like a crab. So all those hard parts of the fly are all that was left. It basically drank up all the liquid insides of him, just leaving that hard exoskeleton on the outside to blow away in the dust. So pretty cool stuff here. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. So with that, I will leave you guys, and hopefully if you have any questions, make sure to totally email me, send me whatever questions you guys have, and I'm absolutely here anytime you guys need me. So have a wonderful week, and I will see you guys shortly.